Happy Thursday, Foods2. Today we're going to talk about cooking meat, or four-legged beasts. All right, and then next Tuesday we'll talk about how to cook poultry and seafood. So we're going to start with beef because it's the most popular of what we eat here in America. So when we say beef, these are cattle that are more than a year old. Now, the most common question is, what cut of meat is tender and which cut is not tender? Or we're going to say less tender. Right? And how it's determined is by what muscles the cow uses to walk around the pasture. And we call those locomotion muscles because they are using those muscles, and so they get tough, they get strong. It's the same thing that happens to us when we work out, lift weights. What happens to our muscles? They get really tough. So if you interlock your fingers and you squeeze because you're using them, it makes it tough. The support muscles are just there to kind of hold the animal up. It's not really using those muscles to move around, so we call them support muscles. Those ones are more tender. The other thing that makes meat tender is the marbling. So the marbling is what adds the flecks of fat in the meat. All right, so you can see here a couple of ribeye steaks, and ribeye steaks are considered tender cuts of meat. All right, and you can see all of the flecks, the marbling. I'm not talking about the fat that's around the steak. I'm talking about the fat that's in the steak. It looks like marble. That's why we call it marbling. So the more marbling there is, the more tender it's going to be. All right, so we have a little picture of a cow, and we're going to talk about where on the cow is a less tender cut of meat versus a tender cut of meat. So as we go through this little diagram, we're going to kind of go clockwise around the cow. Ask yourself, is it using that muscle to move around? If it is, it's a less tender cut of meat. So we're going to start back here at the round. The round is that back leg muscle, kind of the hindquarters of the cow. It uses those muscles, so it's less tender. Right, then we have the flank. Flank is where we get things like London broil, skirt steak, which they make carne asada out of. It's considered a less tender cut of meat. We have the short plate. We have the shank and the brisket. We have the chuck. The chuck is that front shoulder. It is probably one of the tougher cuts of meat because it's that front shoulder that the animal is always using to walk around. Now, the next four are the support muscles. So these are all the tender cuts of meat. The rib, the short loin, the sirloin, and the rump. These are also where all of the expensive cuts of meat come from. Things like ribeye, filet mignon, T-bone, all of those things come from this area. Okay, it's for two reasons why they're so expensive, because it's the least amount of meat on the cow, and it's the most tender cut of meat. It's what people want to buy, so they raise the price of that. Now, does that mean that a flank steak isn't delicious? No, it doesn't. You just have to know how to prepare it. Is brisket bad? No, you just have to know how to prepare it. Can you eat a chuck steak and have it be good? Of course, you just have to know how to prepare it, because now you know where it comes from on the cow requires a different preparation method. Right, so the only difference between a tender cut and a less tender cut is the price. It's the same nutritionally, and as long as you know what you're doing, you can have a really quality meal. So when my husband and I were in college at SUU, we had some friends that invited us to their family cabin up by Bryce Canyon, and we were going to have a barbecue. And we were poor college students, and so they bought chuck steaks. All right, because chuck steak was relatively cheap compared to like ribeye or T-bone. Now, they didn't do anything to prepare that chuck steak at first. They just threw it on the grill. It was like eating shoe leather. You chewed and you chewed and you chewed and you chewed, because a chuck steak can't just be thrown on the grill. There are a couple things, or there are better ways to prepare it. So we're going to go over the different cooking methods. And so remember, how you cook the meat is determined by where that meat comes from. Sorry. Okay. So if it's a tender cut of meat, you are going to use a dry cooking method. All right, that means that there's no liquid involved, no moisture, it's just dry heat. So we have a couple of dry heat methods. First is broil. This is a direct heat source. It's a really high heat, and it's located above the food. We used this when we made meatballs. We turned on that broiler element in our ovens. They glowed red, and it's really close to the food and it cooks it. Next is grill. This is when you cook on a rack with the heat source below the food. Roast is when you use the hot, dry air in the oven to cook the food. So, like, it's the same as bake, but you bake cookies and cakes and bread, you roast meat. All right, now the next ones are kind of confusing because it uses fat. Fat, like oil, is not a liquid in cooking. It is a fat. So we consider it a dry heat cooking method. So saute, stir fry, deep fat fry, those are all dry methods because even though you're using oil, it's not a liquid, it's a fat. So saute and stir fry, you're cooking in a little bit of oil on high heat. If you're sauteing, you don't stir it constantly because you want that caramelization to happen. If you're stir frying, you are stirring constantly. And then deep fat fry, the food is submerged in oil, but again, we consider it a dry heat. Now, moist cooking methods are for less tender cuts of meat, and it helps tenderize them because the moisture gets in between those muscle fibers and softens it up. So, but I'm going to be honest, the ones that are shown here, I probably wouldn't use for beef, all right? You can use these ones for chicken, but I wouldn't use them for beef. But parboil is when you cook it partially in boiling water and you take it out before it's done. You could blanch it, that's when you cook it in boiling water, and then you immediately put it in ice water to stop the cooking process. Simmer, the water's not quite boiling yet, or the liquid. Steam, you cook it above it. Steam works good with fish, which we'll talk about next week. And then anytime slow cooking is also known as crock pot. You put the liquid in there with the meat and then it sits or it cooks for several hours, softening those muscle fibers. Now, better ways to do meat if it's a less tender cut is with a combination method. So it's going to use dry heat to caramelize the outside, and then you use moist heat to tenderize it. So our two combination methods are stewing. You do this when you make stew. You brown the meat, usually with like onions and garlic and carrots, the mirepoix, and then you cover it with liquid and you simmer it for a couple of hours. That breaks apart those muscle fibers in the meat to make it tender. And the next one is braising. This is when you brown it in fat and then you simmer it in liquid, but the liquid does not cover the food. It goes up like about halfway. So usually when you braise, you put a lid on it, put it in your oven. This is how a lot of people make like pot roast and things with those tougher cuts of meat or less tender cuts. All right, and then one more method because it's super popular right now, and that is pressure cooking. It's where you're using steam and pressure to soften the muscle fibers. Instant Pot is taking over America. Everybody has one. If you don't have one, get one. Right? Because you can take those cheaper cuts of meat and make delicious meals out of them because it uses pressure. Don't be afraid of it. It's perfectly safe. It's not like the pressure cooker from the 60s and 70s that exploded on people and killed them. I'm just kidding. It really didn't kill them, but people are afraid of it. Don't be afraid of them. Now, if you have a less tender cut of meat, can you use a dry heat method on it? Of course, if my friends in college would have taken those chuck steaks and done one of these methods and then put it on the barbecue, it would have been a much more enjoyable meal. So, you can marinate it. All marinade contains an acid. That acid breaks down the fibers, right? Whether it's lemon juice, vinegar, tomato juice, pineapple juice, all marinades contain some kind of acid. And that acid breaks down those tough cuts of meat. A meat mallet. The reason we have meat mallets is to flatten meat to make it thinner, but also it can take those less tender cuts of meat and you're physically breaking down the fibers. And you can score it. That's when you make shallow cuts on the surface of a meat. So this is a picture of London broil. If you just make those shallow cuts and then you marinate it, it will be even more delicious and more tender. So any of those methods will take those less tender cuts and then you can use dry heat. But don't just take the chuck steaks and throw them on the grill. It doesn't work. It's too tough. All right, if you're not sure, all the meat labels tell you what part of the animal it comes from. So if you look, a beef loin, it comes from the loin. Well, first is beef, it's cow. It comes from the loin, and then it gives you like the commercial name. So this is a New York steak. This is a porterhouse steak. That's the retail name or the commercial name. But here's tells you the animal, the part of the animal it came from, and then they'll tell you if it's bone in or boneless. Some stores are nice and tell you how to cook it. Like it will say this is best for grilling. Others will say this is best for stewing. So sometimes they put those labels on there to kind of help the consumer choose the best product. Here's an example of pork. So pork, it's from the shoulder, so you know it's a less tender cut because the animal uses that as for locomotion. All right, ground beef. What they do to make ground beef is they take all of the less tender cuts of meat that can't be sold and they grind them up. All right, we also call it hamburger. Now it's available with different percentages of fat. So they have different percentages, like regular is considered 20 or 75-25. That means it's 75% beef and then 25% of the mixture is fat. And yes, they just add chunks of the animal fat to it as they're grinding it. Lean is a little bit lower in fat, 85-15. So 85% of its meat, 15% of its fat. Extra lean is 92 and then 8% fat, and then skinny beef has less than 5% fat. And you can see that the color goes darker red as you kind of go to more to the fat-free side because it's not ground up with fat, it's just strictly meat. It's probably not going to be very flavorful, but if that's something you're keeping track of, get the skinnier beef. All right, you can also purchase ground lamb, ground pork, and ground veal. Remember, with any ground meat, there's more bacteria ground throughout it, so make sure you cook it thoroughly. All right, we're going to talk about the 3 other 4-legged beasts that we eat. So veal is a baby cow. They're usually 1 to 3 months old. It has a really mild flavor. It doesn't really taste like beef. It's more mild than that, but it doesn't taste quite like chicken. And then it's a light gray pink color, and it has very little fat. All right, because the cow has only been alive for 1 to 3 months. It didn't have time to fatten up. All right, with veal, almost all of it's going to be tender. Again, because even if it uses these muscles for locomotion, it didn't have time to go romp and play in the pasture with its cousins. All right, so it's still all going to be pretty tender. All right, next up is pork. So in the early 80s, the pork industry really suffered because pork was very, very fatty. And it had a parasite called trichinosis, which was a microscopic worm that lived in the pork's muscle. When humans ate it and they didn't kill that parasite, the trichinosis lived in them, and it became a huge problem. So the pork industry really had to change how pigs are raised. And so now pork is considered very lean. They call it the other white meat. It has the same fat content as chicken. And trichinosis is pretty much eliminated in the United States. Right, common cuts that we use are pork loin, ham. Some of you will have ham next week instead of turkey for Thanksgiving. Pork chops, ribs, and then bacon. Everybody's favorite. All right, next up is lamb. We don't eat a lot of lamb in the United States. If we lived in the UK, Australia, we'd be more familiar with lamb. But it is sheep that are less than a year old. And it has a unique, mild flavor. It is very, very bright red, even when it's cooked and it's well done. It is very, very red. Like it looks like really rare steak. I personally don't enjoy lamb, but you do you if you like it. All right, cooking temperatures. Remember, if it's all ground up, so any ground meat needs to be cooked to 155 degrees. And then whole pork, beef, veal, and lamb is cooked to 145 degrees. That's still pretty rare if you like rare steak for your beef. Remember, pork is still kind of pink. Don't cook it until it's not pink anymore. That's overcooked. So make sure you're using a thermometer. All right, go on Canvas after you watch this and complete the little diagram of the cow and tell me a way to cook that part of the cow. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. Talk to you next week. Bye.